So, Hugh, tell us where we are and what do you do here?
Yeah, Karl, we're here at the Scots College in Bellevue Hill in Sydney, near the harbour, near Bondi Beach, and I have the privilege of teaching boys history, and I'm also Director of Research and Professional Learning, so helping our staff to really catch the vision and be able to do the best job possible by their boys.
Yeah, that's interesting. Research and professional development, is that is mostly for the teachers, or is it both?
Yeah, mainly for the teachers, and but also trying to share what we learn here with others. Yep. So partnerships with schools and universities around the world. It's a really exciting place to be.
As a Christian, does that influence what you do here?
Yeah, definitely. I think we are made for a purpose, and it's such a privilege as an educator to think about not just who's this child and what are their gifts and abilities and what can they do, but what's God calling them to do in the world. I often think of the boys who come through a school like this. You know, they could be William Wilberforces. They could go on and have a kind of a hinge effect on the course of history. So it's such a privilege, and to be able to be open about your faith and to work with such amazing boys and staff is a real privilege. What
was the pivotal point in your life from a faith perspective?
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian family, and at the time you sort of push back against that, but it was a great privilege. My dad's a minister in a church, and I think I probably enjoyed going to church each week and things like that. But looking back, I think Jesus was probably a little bit abstract and probably a bit of a means to an end. I was a pretty ambitious young guy, and Jesus was convenient at points. So I took a year off after school, travelled to the UK, and kind of lived fairly uninterruptedly there. And I remember I would backpack all through Europe and have a big Bible in my backpack, and I took it everywhere I went, but I never actually read it. And I remember one afternoon very clearly, the people I was living with went out to a nightclub called The Church. It was a Sunday afternoon. I thought, that's a bridge too far for me. So I was sitting there, I was probably a bit bored, a bit prompted, and I just started reading the Bible. And I remember flicking through, and a verse from the Psalm 27 verse 8 just kind of leapt off the page at me, and it said, "My heart has heard you say, come and talk with me," and my heart responds, "Lord, I'm coming." And I think something happened. The Holy Spirit just made clear to me there that God wanted to talk to me, and He wanted to have a relationship with me, and I just was blown away at the opportunity to have that relationship with the Maker of the universe.
Why this career?
A lot of accidents and just
no other
the
openings.
Next step. That's right. Looked around, but just taking the next steps and saying, all right, what might God be putting before me? But I do think, having been in schools for some years now, I think I'm really convinced that being part of the formation of young lives has this kind of ripple effect. You can shape families and communities and whole nations, and you can do that across generations. So, a bit like, the little seed that gets planted growing into the big oak. It's pretty special to be doing something that can have a lasting and eternal impact.
Yeah. You had a significant piece of research around a PhD. Why did you do the research on that?
Yeah, I was studying Australian history and finding that there's this missing element to the story that we tell ourselves about what it means to be Australian, where we've come from, what's important. We often think about Australia having been a British nation, a white nation, and a Christian nation, and that very kind of obviously fading away to the way we are today. But good historians know that nothing's inevitable, nothing has a straight linear progression to it. And so I was really curious about, how did we get to where we are today? And particularly the relationship between Christian faith and what it means to be Australian. Something's changed there. Yep. How did that happen? What did that mean? And what does that mean for us today?
Now, you put that down to a pivotal period of time, and it wasn't from, kind of the beginning of this modern Australian history, that in the middle of the 20th century something shifted. And you looked at 2 points. What were the 2 points?
Yeah, so the 60s and 70s, and I think framed by the 1959 Billy Graham crusade, which was this incredible moment. Perhaps we'll talk a bit more about that. It's an incredible moment of public religion in Australia. And his last visit to Australia in 1979, when you could really see that a lot had changed and Christianity had lost that central place in not just people's spiritual life, but in defining what it meant to be Australian.
Yeah. Most people might know the name Billy Graham, but who was Billy Graham and what was the 1959 crusade?
Billy Graham was a Southern Baptist preacher. He was born at the end of World War I. And then after World War II, he emerged as one of the leading evangelists around the world. He'd speak to packed stadiums all over the place. He'd have tea with the Queen and he'd be friends with presidents. A really influential figure. Probably spoke to more people in person than any other person in history. And he was invited to Australia by all of the Protestant churches for a crusade in 1959. He was here for 3 months. He spoke hundreds of times to thousands of people and packed out stadiums around the country. He, in fact, holds the record for attendance at the MCG. I mean, the cauldron of Australian religiosity has the record held by Billy Graham, and 130,000 people made a decision for Christ. It made a profound impact on the fabric of Australian life.
If you go back to the 1950s, is there a way of giving a short summary of what the Christian activity in Australia in the 1950s was?
I think the 1950s is often viewed as a pretty stale decade. Not much happened, and it was just a period of conservatism. But it was actually a period of a lot of dynamism in Australia, and particularly Australian religious life. So a lot of people went to church regularly. 3 out of 10 Australians said that they were in church every Sunday. People sent their kids to Sunday school. You didn't have a choice about that. There was a healthy competition between denominations, and sometimes a pretty fierce rivalry between Protestants and Catholics, and a sense in which everybody thought of themselves as part of a Christian country and expressed that in different ways. And it was a decade as well in which I think some of the seeds for change were starting to be seen, but it really wasn't clear that you'd have this tumult of the 60s following on afterwards.
So you have this really quite active church life. It's a really kind of just part of our culture. Get to the 1980s and it's very different. So what happened?
It's hard to put your finger on one particular thing that changed. Everything was changing in the 60s and 70s. I think it was a really energetic time as a result of that. But I think the big change, Karl, that took place was that people started to find their sense of identity, their source of identity, more and more within themselves. That, I'm here to express my individuality rather than necessarily connect to a communal, a corporate sense of what it means to be me, what it means to be human, what it means to be Australian. So there are lots of things changing. Some things are big and shocking, like no-fault divorce and the changes to Sunday trading and stuff like that. But there are also some really kind of banal things, like the Sunday night movie gets introduced and more people have cars and there are more options for other forms of entertainment. So there's a lot going on there, and in the midst of all of that, there's a change taking place, not just in going to church, but in what it means to be Australian.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, isn't it, to you? Because there was a bit like, it's not like people decided to stop going to church and then but there was something formulating in the way we thought about ourselves. What about the kind of Vietnam War, and then you have this, we invent almost the teenage years. Those two things, like the baby boomers and the Vietnam War, interacted with all of that as well.
Yeah, it's certainly a period of a lot of tumult, and I think the kind of received authority figures are more and more up for question, and there's some justification for that. And I think there's a sense in which young people are looking for other forms of identity and entertainment and things like that. But what I found quite interesting is that those people really talking about a crisis of faith or a changing nature of Australia aren't the young people. They're not the baby boomers. They're actually the wartime generation. They're their parents. They're already leaders in society, and they're the ones who are actually talking about a secular society, about the decline of faith, and in some ways, strangely precipitating those changes.
Yeah. We're just so used to research. Everybody researches everything. But there wasn't a lot of research around faith and belief, and there's Hans Mol. What did he do and what was his research?
Hans Mol was a Dutch Presbyterian sociologist. Fascinating story. He was imprisoned by the Gestapo in World War II and came to faith pretty much on his deathbed, and came out to Australia and started to explore how Australians think about their faith. And he conducted the first major study of the beliefs of Australians in 1966, right in the middle of all these changes. And he found, interestingly enough, that the picture was better and worse than most people were saying. Most people were pretty positive towards religion and the church. They thought, the church had an important place in society, and they thought that, they believed in God, and many affirmed that they went to church. But when Hans Moll drilled into what they actually thought about God and what they actually believed about the Bible, he found that the content of their belief was a bit woolly. And so he described Australia as either a Christian nation in flight from religion or a heathen nation in search of one.
Your research demonstrated that in the 1950s, church attendance was fairly regular and just a normal part of Australian society, yet we're settled by convicts, and there's this notion that we've always been secular or secular from the beginning, but that doesn't sort of ring true with a nation that's turning up the church every week, it seems.
Yeah, it's funny how powerful those ideas can be, but actually the evidence runs totally contrary. Often Australians have looked across the Pacific to America and saw the Pilgrim Fathers and saw that, we're founded by the prodigal sons, but actually the whole culture from which Australia came, the British culture, was deeply Christian. Even if you're convicts, often convicts would have Bible verses tattooed on their bodies. So it's a deeply Christian culture, and everywhere you look, if you have eyes to see, faith runs deep all the way through till the 1960s.
Yeah. When this has changed as we've been saying, between the 60s, 70s and 80s, so as you look at, coming out of your research, as you look at Australia now, are we just thoroughly secular?
I think we're in a funny position in Australia now. And it's a bit like, if you're driving along, say in a Holden Ute, and everything looks shiny on the outside, but you feel like, the momentum's slowing, and you tap the fuel gauge, there's a problem there, and you maybe pull over and lift the lid, and you realise that actually the oil hasn't been changed in a long time, that chassis is decaying. It looks good on the outside, but something about the fundamental drivers of the things that we take for granted about being a cohesive society, about the dignity of the person, about what it means to think about a vision for life. A lot of those things that we got from the Christian faith, that we drew on deeply, aren't having their roots sustained in the same way. So I think we're not a secular society, not as secular as we think. We're certainly not as Christian as we were, but we perhaps neglect that long story at our peril, and perhaps we need to think again about the ways in which Christian faith really gave depth and durability and freshness to what it meant to be Australian.